A starved dog will happily chew on a poisoned bone, provided the meat is sweet enough to make him forget the trap. The ash fell over the Appalachian Mountains like gray snow, choking the valleys in a thick, suffocating blanket of misery and burnt timber. The Great Coal Wars had completely shattered our corner of West Virginia. What started as a strike had devolved into a brutal, bloody massacre between the desperate Union miners and the heavily armed company militia. The valleys were filled with the smoke of burning tent colonies, and the dirt roads were clogged with hundreds of displaced, starving families fleeing the indiscriminate gunfire. The military had been called in to enforce martial law, leaving the survivors to scavenge for shelter in a landscape that looked like the very mouth of hell. I was a broken man, dragging my shattered family through the mud and the freezing rain. My wife, Martha, was 8 months pregnant, her face hollowed out by starvation, her trembling hands constantly cradling her swollen stomach as she gasped for breath in the thin, ash-choked air. Clinging to my coat were my 2 younger sisters, Ruth and Sarah, both entirely mute with the trauma of watching our mining camp burn to the ground 3 nights prior. We had lost everything. We were running on the absolute fumes of human endurance. We finally reached the federal relief outpost in the valley, a hastily constructed blockade of sandbags and wooden crates manned by exhausted men with rifles. Inside the cramped, canvas command tent, a sweating government clerk named Higgins was desperately stamping paperwork, completely overwhelmed by the tide of human suffering pouring into his station. I pushed my way to the front of the frantic crowd, wrapping my arms around Martha to shield her from the crushing bodies. "Please," I begged, slamming my bruised hands down on the clerk's folding table. "My wife is going to give birth in the mud. I have 2 young girls with me. We don't need food, we just need a tent. A quarter, a dry floor, anything." Higgins didn't even look up from his ledger. "The camps are at triple capacity, buddy. We got cholera breaking out in Sector 4. I don't have a single canvas flap left to give you. Move along." "Look at her," I roared, my voice cracking with absolute, raw desperation. I grabbed Higgins by the collar of his uniform, pulling him close. "If she sleeps in the freezing rain tonight, she and the baby will die. I am begging you as a man. Find us a roof." Higgins stared into my frantic, bloodshot eyes, and then his gaze drifted to Martha's pale, trembling face. A flicker of pity broke through his bureaucratic armor. He reached under the table, unlocked a small metal lockbox, and pulled out a heavy, rusted iron key. "There's an estate," Higgins whispered, his eyes darting around the tent to ensure no one was listening. "The old Sterling Manor, up on the bluffs overlooking the river. It's completely vacant." "I'll take it," I said instantly, reaching for the key. Higgins pulled his hand back, his expression darkening into a grim, deeply unsettled warning. "Listen to me closely. The house is empty because the worst of the riots happened right on its front steps 3 days ago. The mob completely overran that sector. There is no running water. The electrical lines were slashed. It is dark, it is isolated, and it is a graveyard. If you go up there, you are completely on your own." "I only need a roof over my family's heads," I replied, my voice hard and resolute. I snatched the heavy iron key from his trembling fingers. As we stepped back out into the freezing mud, the deafening, mechanical shriek of the mining whistle echoed through the valley. It was the curfew siren. The military had declared that anyone caught on the streets after dark would be shot on sight as a looter. The sun was already bleeding behind the jagged peaks, casting long, violent purple shadows across the ruined town. We had to move fast. The route to the Sterling Manor was an agonizing uphill climb through the wealthiest, most isolated sector of the company town. But the streets here were completely unrecognizable. The cobblestones were torn up, barricades of burnt furniture blocked the alleys, and the dense, freezing fog rolling off the river made it impossible to see more than 10 feet ahead. Ruth, my younger sister, clutched my sleeve, her voice trembling violently. "Caleb, we're going in circles. I swear to God we've passed this burnt-out carriage 3 times. The streets don't make any sense." She was right. The fog and the twisted, ruined architecture created a suffocating labyrinth. The deeper we walked into the bluffs, the heavier the air felt. It didn't just smell like smoke anymore. It smelled like copper, spoiled meat, and old, wet earth. It felt as though the very geography of the mountain was shifting around us, actively trying to swallow us whole. Finally, looming out of the thick gray fog like a rotting monolith, we saw it. The Stirling Manor. It was a massive, sprawling Victorian structure built of dark mahogany and black iron, completely isolated behind a wrought iron gate. The windows were entirely dark, staring down at us like hollow, dead eyes. I pushed the heavy iron gates open, the hinges screaming in the dead silence of the curfew. We hurried up the stone steps. I slid the rusted key into the heavy front door. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clack, and we pushed our way inside, instantly sealing ourselves off from the freezing wind. The interior of the manor was completely pitch black. The air was incredibly stale, suffocatingly thick with dust and a metallic stench that immediately made my stomach churn. I pulled a book of matches from my coat pocket and struck one, holding the small, flickering yellow flame up to illuminate the grand foyer. The opulence of the house was entirely ruined. The velvet wallpaper was shredded. The heavy mahogany furniture had been violently smashed to splinters. "Caleb?" Martha whimpered, her hands gripping my arm with terrifying strength. "Something is wrong. The air in here, it feels heavy. It feels like we are standing in a closed coffin." "It's just the dust, sweetheart," I lied, desperately trying to project a calm authority I did not feel. "Let's find the kitchen. We need to get you off your feet." I struck another match, leading them down a long, winding corridor toward the back of the house. As we passed what used to be the grand parlor, the weak light of my match illuminated a dark, massive lump lying in the center of the ruined Persian rug. I stepped closer, squinting through the gloom. It was a body. It was a man, face down in the shadows, his clothes completely stiff with dried, blackened blood. The back of his skull had been violently caved in. The metallic smell of rot in the parlor was absolutely overpowering. My heart slammed against my ribs. I knew if Martha or the girls saw the corpse, their fragile minds would completely shatter. "Stay out in the hall," I barked, turning around quickly and blocking the doorway with my body. The match burned down to my fingers, singeing my skin, but I didn't flinch. "What is it? What's in there?" Ruth asked, her voice hitching with rising panic. "Just a pile of rotting tapestries that the rioters tore down," I lied smoothly, the desperation giving me a terrifying capability for deceit. "It smells horrible. We aren't sleeping in this wing. Come on, the kitchen is this way." I ushered them quickly past the parlor, the heavy knowledge of the dead man pressing down on my spine like an anvil. We found the kitchen at the rear of the manor. It was a massive industrial space with a giant cast-iron stove. True to the clerk's warning, the brass faucets groaned and spat nothing but dry rust. There was no power, but in the corner of the pantry, sealed inside a heavy wooden barrel, I found a large canvas sack of dry oats and cornmeal that the looters had missed. We gathered around the cold hearth. I tore up the wooden legs of a smashed dining chair and managed to build a small smoky fire inside the cast-iron stove. We melted snow we had carried in from the windowsill and boiled the oats into a thick, tasteless gruel. It was the first food we had eaten in 2 days. We ate in absolute, suffocating silence, the sheer exhaustion temporarily overriding our terror. I arranged a bed of old, heavy drapes for Martha on the kitchen floor near the warmth of the stove. Ruth and Sarah curled up together in the corner. I sat by the iron door with a heavy iron fire poker across my knees, determined to keep watch over my family. But the house would not let us rest. Around 2 in the morning, the temperature inside the kitchen inexplicably plummeted. The small fire in the stove didn't die out, but its heat was entirely neutralized by a sudden, bone-chilling cold that seeped up through the floorboards. Martha began to violently thrash in her sleep. She wasn't just tossing and turning. Her body was contorting in spasms of absolute agony. Her hands clawed desperately at her own throat, her fingernails drawing thin lines of blood on her pale skin. "Martha, wake up!" I hissed, dropping the iron poker and falling to my knees beside her. I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her hard. Her eyes snapped open. They were rolled completely back into her skull, exposing nothing but the whites. She let out a long, ragged, wet gasp that didn't sound like her voice at all. It sounded like someone trying to breathe while actively drowning. "They're burning?" Martha choked out, her voice a deep, overlapping, masculine rasp that sent a violent shockwave of pure terror through my nervous system. "They are burning the dress. They are dragging her down the stairs. The soil is screaming." She violently blinked, her pupils snapping back into focus. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks, completely unaware of the demonic voice that had just ripped through her vocal cords. "Caleb," she sobbed, burying her face into my chest, her pregnant belly trembling against me. The nightmares are so heavy. I saw a girl in a white dress being torn apart by a mob of men in the dark. I held her tight, staring out into the pitch-black hallway of the kitchen, the heavy iron poker suddenly feeling completely useless in my hands. The riots hadn't just destroyed the Sterling Manor. They had trapped something deeply malicious, something violated and overflowing with rage, directly inside the walls. And we had just locked ourselves inside the cage with it. The dawn did not bring light to the Sterling Manor. It only diluted the suffocating blackness into a sickly, bruised gray. The fog pressing against the shattered windows was so thick it looked like wet wool, sealing us inside a tomb of freezing mahogany and rot. I sat awake the entire night, the iron fire poker cutting deep grooves into my palms, listening to the rhythmic, agonizingly slow dripping of rusted water from the ceiling. By mid-morning, the hunger had returned with a violent, cramping vengeance, but the psychological toll of the house was far worse. The air inside the manor was actively deteriorating. The oppressive, coppery stench of old blood I had smelled in the grand parlor the night before was slowly creeping through the floorboards, infecting the kitchen. And then the auditory hallucinations began. It started as a low, vibratory hum in the walls, barely perceptible beneath the howling of the mountain wind. Sarah, my youngest sister, was the first to react. She was huddled by the cold cast-iron stove, her knees pulled tight to her chest, trembling violently. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice paper-thin and fragile. "Who is crying?" I froze, straining my ears against the silence. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the cracked chimney flues. But as I listened, the sound sharpened. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a woman weeping. The sobs were heavy, guttural, and laced with absolute, suffocating despair. But the weeping wasn't alone. Beneath the cries, there was a rhythmic, overlapping chanting. It sounded like an old, distorted gospel hymn, but the words were warped, sung backward or in a language that made the hair on my arms stand up. It echoed down from the grand staircase, looping endlessly through the dark corridors. "It's just the wind off the river, Sarah." I lied, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Don't listen to it." I looked around the kitchen to check on the others. Martha was asleep on her makeshift bed of heavy drapes, her face slick with an unnatural, feverish sweat. Sarah was shivering by the stove, but Ruth was gone. Panic hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "Ruth!" I called out, my voice cracking in the freezing air. "Ruth, where are you?" Silence. Only the distorted, weeping hymn echoing from the upper floors answered me. I grabbed the heavy iron poker and sprinted out of the kitchen, plunging into the dark, labyrinthine guts of the manor. The cold in the hallway was biting, stinging my lungs with every ragged breath. I ran past the grand parlor, intentionally averting my eyes from the dark shadows where I knew the murdered man lay, and reached the bottom of the grand mahogany staircase. "Ruth!" I roared. The sound of my own voice terrified me in the massive, empty cavern of the foyer. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the wooden treads screaming in protest under my heavy boots. The second floor was untouched by the rioters. It was a pristine, undisturbed gallery of unimaginable wealth. The walls were lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men and women whose eyes seemed to follow me in the gloom. The weeping sound was louder up here. It felt as though it was seeping directly out of the wallpaper. I found her at the end of the long corridor, standing inside the master bedroom suite. The heavy double doors were wide open. The room was immaculate, dominated by a massive, 4-poster bed draped in rotting white lace. Ruth was standing in the center of the room, her back to me, facing a tall, ornate vanity mirror. "Ruth, what are you doing up here?" I gasped, rushing into the room and grabbing her by the shoulder. "I told you not to leave the kitchen." When I spun her around, the breath was violently punched out of my lungs. Ruth wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes completely glazed over with a milky, dead film. But that wasn't what paralyzed me with terror. Clasped tightly around her pale, dirt-streaked neck was a heavy, antique piece of jewelry. It was a thick velvet choker, fastened with a massive, cracked obsidian stone set in tarnished silver. But the velvet wasn't originally black. It was a deep crimson red that had been completely soaked and stiffened by decades-old dried blood. The dark, rusted flakes of the blood were peeling off the fabric and sticking to the sweat on my sister's neck. "Take that off right now," I commanded, my voice trembling as I reached out to unclasp the horrid thing. The moment my fingers brushed the cold silver of the obsidian stone, Ruth's entire body violently convulsed. Her spine arched backward at a terrifying, unnatural angle. A sickening series of loud, wet pops echoed through the silent bedroom as her joints seemingly dislocated and snapped back into place. Her head whipped downward, her chin burying into her chest, her dark hair falling forward to completely obscure her face. "Ruth," I whispered, taking a slow step backward, raising the iron poker in my trembling hand. She slowly raised her head. The milky film in her eyes was gone. Her irises had dilated so massively that her eyes appeared as 2 bottomless, pitch-black voids. The muscles in her face were twitching rapidly, her jaw unhinging slightly as a thick, dark saliva pooled at the corners of her mouth. When she spoke, the sound shattered my soul. It wasn't my 14-year-old sister's voice. It was a chaotic, overlapping chorus of 3 distinct voices speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. One was the weeping woman I had heard in the hallway. One was a deep, guttural, masculine roar. And the third was a screeching, metallic hiss that sounded like a rusted saw blade cutting through bone. They burned the veil. The entity spoke through Ruth's lips, the overlapping voices vibrating with such intense malice that the glass in the vanity mirror behind her spider-webbed with a loud crack. They dragged us down the stairs by our hair. They took our eyes. And now you will bleed on our floorboards. Get out of her, I screamed, a primal, protective rage momentarily overriding my terror. I lunged forward, desperately trying to grab the blood-soaked choker. Ruth didn't just push me away. The entity inside her struck me with the force of a speeding freight train. Her small, pale hand shot out and clamped around my throat with an iron, crushing grip. She lifted me entirely off my feet. I am a grown man, hardened by 10 years in the coal mines, but I was entirely powerless against the supernatural strength coursing through her veins. I choked, my vision instantly exploding with white stars as she hurled me across the massive bedroom. I crashed into a heavy mahogany armoire, the wood splintering upon impact, and collapsed onto the floorboards, gasping violently for air. Ruth began to march toward me. Her gait was entirely wrong. Her limbs moved with a jerky, mechanical stiffness, her bare feet slapping wetly against the hardwood. She was tearing the room apart with her sheer proximity. The oil lamps on the nightstands violently shattered. The heavy velvet curtains tore themselves from their brass rods. The temperature in the room plummeted to sub-zero, our breath turning to thick, white smoke. You thought you could claim our sanctuary? You thought you could sleep in our graveyard? The demon mocked, the overlapping voices reaching a deafening, hysterical pitch. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my fingers frantically searching the floor for the iron poker I had dropped. I found the cold metal handle just as Ruth lunged for me again, her unhinged jaw snapping wildly. I didn't strike her. I couldn't hurt my own sister. Instead, I brought the heavy iron bar up and slammed it horizontally across her chest, using it as a barricade to shove her backward. The impact knocked her off balance. She shrieked, a high, vibrating sound of pure agony, and stumbled into the shattered vanity mirror. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed her by the collar of her ragged dress, and dragged her thrashing, screaming body out of the bedroom. I hauled her down the grand staircase, my muscles burning, my heart threatening to explode from my chest. She fought me with demonic ferocity, her fingernails tearing deep, bleeding gouges into my forearms, but adrenaline fueled my desperate sprint. I dragged her into the kitchen, throwing her onto the cold stone floor. Martha and Sarah screamed in unison, scrambling backward against the far wall. Grab your coats. Grab everything. We are leaving right now. I roared over Ruth's chaotic, hissing laughter. Caleb, what is wrong with her? What is happening? Martha shrieked, clutching her pregnant stomach as she watched Ruth contort on the floor, her limbs twisting into sickening, impossible shapes. Don't look at her. Just move, I yelled. I hauled Martha to her feet and grabbed Sarah by the arm. The curfew siren didn't matter anymore. The freezing rain didn't matter. The armed militia in the streets didn't matter. There was nothing out in that Appalachian wilderness that was worse than the rot consuming this house. I dragged my weeping, terrified family down the dark corridor toward the massive front double doors. Ruth followed us. She wasn't running. She was crawling. She scuttled along the walls and the ceiling like a massive, deformed insect, her black eyes locked onto us, the bloody choker tight around her neck. We reached the foyer. I threw myself at the heavy mahogany doors. I grabbed the rusted iron handle and violently twisted it. It didn't move. I pulled with every ounce of strength in my exhausted body, screaming in frustration. The door was completely fused. It wasn't just locked. It felt as though the wood had physically melded with the stone frame. I grabbed the heavy iron key from my pocket and jammed it into the lock, twisting it so hard the metal handle snapped off in my bleeding palm. "Open the door," Martha wailed, pounding her fists against the unyielding wood. I spun around, looking at the massive, arched windows flanking the doorway. I raised the iron fire poker like a baseball bat and swung it with bone-shattering force against the glass. The iron hit the window and bounced off with a dull, heavy thud. The glass didn't shatter. It didn't even scratch. It was as impenetrable as solid steel. The house had completely sealed itself. We were entombed inside the belly of the beast. Ruth dropped from the ceiling, landing in the center of the foyer with a heavy, wet slap. The shadows in the room began to lengthen, stretching unnaturally across the floorboards like creeping black oil. The temperature dropped so drastically that frost instantly bloomed across the walls, freezing the moisture in the air. I pushed Martha and Sarah behind me, stepping between them and my possessed sister. I dropped the broken fire poker. Physical weapons were entirely useless against this nightmare. I had only one desperate defense left. I fell to my knees on the freezing floorboards, clasping my bleeding hands together, and closed my eyes tightly. I summoned every shred of faith I had left in my hollowed-out soul. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want," I screamed, my voice echoing wildly in the dark foyer. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Ruth stopped crawling. The entity inside her cocked its head, listening to the prayer. "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." I bellowed, tears of sheer, helpless terror streaming down my face. For a single, agonizing second, I thought it was working. The oppressive cold seemed to halt. The shadows stopped creeping. Then, Ruth opened her mouth, and the entity laughed. It was a booming, mocking, horrific sound that shook the very foundation of the manor. The laughter drowned out my prayer completely. "Your God did not bleed on these floorboards, Caleb?" the demon roared, using my name for the first time. The overlapping voices were deafening, a cacophony of pure, unrestrained hatred. "Your God did not listen when they dragged us into the dark. Your prayers hold no power in a house built on unburied bones." Suddenly, the ambient gray light bleeding through the impenetrable windows was violently sucked out of the room. The darkness didn't just fall. It physically crashed down upon us like a collapsing roof. The heavy, coppery stench of blood became so thick I could taste it on my tongue. The entity released a devastating shockwave of dark energy. I was thrown backward, violently slamming into the mahogany doors alongside Martha and Sarah. The darkness consumed us entirely. We were trapped in absolute, screaming blackness, locked inside a house that was actively digesting us, completely at the mercy of the slaughtered dead. The suffocating, absolute darkness of the foyer was not just an absence of light. It was a physical, crushing weight that pressed against my eyeballs and filled my lungs with the taste of old, rotting copper. I lay on the freezing hardwood floor, my arms blindly wrapping around Martha and Sarah as my pregnant wife sobbed hysterically into my chest. Somewhere in the pitch-black cavern of the house, Ruth was crawling. We could hear the wet, heavy slapping of her bare hands and feet against the walls, circling us like a predator playing with its cornered prey. "I have to get us out of here. I have to find a way out," I whispered frantically. My lips pressed directly against Martha's ear so the entity wouldn't hear me. The front doors were supernaturally fused, but my mind raced back to my years working in the coal shafts. I remembered the architecture of these massive bluff estates. They all had heavy, iron coal chutes built into the foundations for winter deliveries. "Listen to me," I breathed, grabbing Sarah's trembling hand. "I am going to get you both down into the root cellar, and I am going to barricade the heavy oak door behind you. Do not make a sound. I am going to crawl up through the coal chute and run down the mountain to the relief camp. I am going to get help. No, Caleb. Please don't leave us in the dark with her. Martha wailed softly, her fingers digging into my coat. I have no choice. If we stay in this room, she is going to tear us apart, I said, my voice breaking with sheer desperation. I hauled them to their feet, relying entirely on memory and touch. I guided my weeping family through the pitch-black corridors, the sound of Ruth's chaotic, overlapping laughter echoing from the ceiling above us. We found the heavy wooden door to the cellar. I shoved them inside the cramped, earthen-floored room, pulling a massive wooden credenza across the hallway to block the door. Pray, Martha. Just keep praying, I choked out, before turning and plunging into the dark belly of the basement. I found the coal chute at the far end of the foundation. It was a narrow, rusted iron tunnel sloping upward toward the frozen mud of the yard. I squeezed my broad shoulders into the freezing metal pipe, the claustrophobia instantly threatening to crush my mind. I dragged my body upward, my boots frantically kicking against the iron, until my hands met the heavy exterior grate. I punched it. I battered it with my bleeding knuckles until the rusted hinges finally gave way, and I spilled out into the freezing gray dawn. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted down the treacherous, ash-choked mountain road like a madman, my boots slipping on the black ice, my lungs burning with the freezing air. I reached the military blockade at the bottom of the valley just as the camp was waking up. I ignored the shouts of the armed guards and charged directly into the canvas command tent. Higgins, the government clerk who had given me the key, was sitting at his folding table, drinking a tin cup of black coffee. I lunged across the table, knocking the hot coffee onto the dirt floor, and grabbed him by the throat of his uniform. I hauled him over the wood, slamming him down into the mud. You sent my family into a slaughterhouse, I roared, my eyes wild and bloodshot, my voice completely feral. My sister is possessed. The house locked us inside. Tell me what is in that godforsaken manor right now, or I swear to God I will beat you to death in this tent. Higgins scrambled backward, his face completely drained of color, his hands raised in absolute panic. I didn't know it was that bad. I swear to God, I didn't know. He stammered, coughing violently as the tent guards rushed in, raising their rifles at my back. Tell me, I screamed, ignoring the guns. It was the Sterling family, Higgins cried out, his voice trembling with terrified confession. The manor belonged to Elias Sterling and his family. During the height of the riots 3 days ago, a rogue faction of the mob completely overran the bluffs. The Sterlings didn't just flee like the report said, Caleb. They were completely wiped out. The mob slaughtered them inside those walls. The military sealed the house because every single scavenger or looter who has tried to claim that manor since has vanished or been found torn to shreds. No one survives that house. I just needed to get you out of my line. The absolute, crushing reality of his betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I dropped him in the mud, staggering backward, my mind racing with the horrific realization that my pregnant wife and youngest sister were locked in a tomb with the violently murdered dead. Guns ain't gonna do you no good on that mountain, son. The voice came from the entrance of the tent. Standing there was a towering, heavily scarred man wearing a faded black suit and a wide-brimmed hat. He carried a heavy, leather-bound Bible under one arm and a large glass jug of kerosene in his other hand. It was Josiah, an old Appalachian circuit preacher who had spent 40 years pulling men out of collapsed coal mines and performing last rites in the darkest corners of the state. He possessed a deep, unwavering understanding of the spiritual laws that govern these cursed mountains. Josiah looked at my bleeding hands and my terrified eyes. You brought your bloodline into a graveyard, Caleb. The dead don't suffer trespassers who sleep on their unburied bones. If you want to save your wife and your unborn child, you take me to that house right now." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from a supply crate, and Josiah and I sprinted back up the winding, fog-choked road toward the Sterling Manor. When we reached the massive mahogany front doors, they were still supernaturally fused. Josiah didn't bother trying the handle. He instructed me to smash the iron crowbar directly into the heavy brass lock housing. With 3 violent, bone-jarring strikes, the wood splintered, and we kicked the doors open. The interior of the house had completely deteriorated into a nightmare. The freezing air was so thick with the stench of rotting meat and sulfur that my eyes immediately began to water. The shadows in the foyer were physically twisting and writhing along the walls. "Martha! Sarah!" I screamed, rushing toward the hallway where I had barricaded them. "They are mine." The voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Ruth was standing on the landing, but her physical body was undergoing a horrific, agonizing deterioration under the strain of the demonic possession. Her skin was a sickly, bruised gray, the veins pulsing black beneath the surface. The rusted, blood-soaked velvet choker was sinking deeply into the flesh of her neck. She didn't walk down the stairs. She launched herself off the landing, clearing a 20-foot gap in the air, and landed in the foyer in a crouch, her unhinged jaw snapping wildly as she prepared to tear my throat out. Josiah didn't flinch. He didn't raise his Bible. He knew that ancient, violated spirits did not respond to mere words. He unscrewed the cap of the kerosene jug and violently slung the volatile liquid in a wide arc across the hardwood floor, creating a physical barrier between us and my possessed sister. He struck a match against his boot and dropped it onto the floorboards. A massive, roaring wall of blinding orange fire erupted instantly in the dark foyer. The moment the intense heat and light illuminated the room, the entity inside Ruth stopped dead in its tracks. The chaotic, overlapping laughter vanished, replaced instantly by a single, deafening shriek of absolute, mind-breaking terror. Ruth scrambled backward away from the flames, her arms wrapping protectively around her head, violently trembling. "Fire!" the entity screamed, the voice suddenly shifting from a demonic roar to the terrified, weeping wail of a young woman. "No, put it out. It burns. It destroys everything. Please, God, no more fire." Josiah stepped forward, his scarred face illuminated by the roaring flames. "State your name, Spirit. You are standing in the light of the Lord, and you will speak your true name." Ruth lowered her hands, her pitch-black eyes staring through the flames at the preacher. "I am Victoria," she wept, the voice vibrating with a sorrow so profound it physically ached to hear it. "I am Victoria Sterling, the eldest daughter of this house." "Why are you torturing this family, Victoria?" Josiah demanded, his voice steady and commanding. "They did not harm you. Why do you curse this ground?" Ruth's body convulsed as the spirit of Victoria Sterling recounted the horrific tragedy that anchored her to the rotting manor. "We did not run," Victoria wailed, her voice echoing with the agonizing trauma of the slaughtered. "The mob broke through the windows in the dead of night. We were innocent. We tried to give them food, but they only wanted blood. They dragged my father into the parlor and caved his skull in with a hammer. They cornered my younger sister, Eleanor, in the hallway. They brutally assaulted her while my mother screamed. And then, Ruth's hands moved to the blood-soaked choker around her neck, her fingers clawing at it helplessly. I was to be married the next day," Victoria sobbed, tears of black, toxic fluid streaming down my sister's pale cheeks. "I was wearing my white lace wedding dress. They tied me to the banister. They violated my dignity. and then they poured lamp oil over my beautiful dress and set me on fire while I was still breathing. They let me burn to ash in my own home. The absolute horror of her confession hung in the freezing air, heavy and suffocating. They did not bury us, Victoria hissed, her sorrow suddenly reigniting into a blinding, malicious rage. They swept our charred bones and our rotting meat under the floorboards of the root cellar like we were garbage. And now, this family dares to sleep above our unquiet graves? I will take their bodies for my own. Josiah turned to me, his eyes wide with a grim, absolute certainty. The cellar, Caleb, the root cellar where you hid your wife. The bones are under the earth. An unburied soul that was violently murdered cannot leave this plane until the flesh is returned to the earth with dignity. You must unearth them. I didn't wait. I sprinted past the dying wall of fire, charging down the dark corridor toward the cellar. I shoved the heavy wooden credenza aside and threw the door open. Martha and Sarah were huddled in the corner, weeping in absolute terror. "Get back! Both of you! Get back!" I yelled. I fell to my knees on the hard, packed earth of the cellar floor. I didn't have a shovel. I didn't have tools. I used my bare, bleeding hands to violently tear into the frozen dirt. I dug with the frantic, crazed desperation of a man fighting for the souls of his family. The earth was hard and unforgiving, tearing the fingernails from my hands, but I didn't stop. 3 feet down, my bleeding fingers struck something hard. A sickening, putrid wave of rot and scorched bone marrow washed over me. I pulled the loose dirt away, revealing the shattered, blackened skull of Elias Sterling. Beneath him were the charred, fragmented remains of his wife and his 2 daughters, unceremoniously dumped into a shallow pit like slaughtered livestock. Pieces of scorched white lace from a wedding dress were still fused to the blackened ribs of Victoria Sterling. "Josiah, I found them!" I screamed up the hallway. The preacher slowly walked down the corridor, keeping himself between the cellar and the possessed body of my sister. He entered the cramped room, looking down at the horrific, tangled mass of murdered remains. He knelt in the dirt beside me, opened his heavy leather Bible, and began to read the sacred, absolute rights of the dead. He didn't just read the words. He commanded them. He poured a small vial of holy water over the charred bones, offering the Sterling family the dignity, the respect, and the sacred burial they had been violently denied by the mob. But as the final words of the prayer echoed in the cellar, Ruth crawled into the doorway. The entity of Victoria Sterling was fighting the exorcism with every ounce of her remaining rage. The historical injustice she had suffered was too immense, too agonizing to simply let go. "No!" she shrieked, the overlapping voices vibrating so violently the glass jars on the cellar shelves exploded. "They burned my dress. They took my life. I will not go into the dark alone. I am taking this girl's body with me." Ruth raised her hands, her fingers curling into jagged claws, preparing to snap her own neck to complete the possession. "Stop!" I roared, throwing myself in front of my sister, blocking her path. I fell to my knees in the dirt, looking directly into the bottomless, pitch-black eyes of the murdered bride. "Take me?" I wept, my voice breaking completely, offering the only thing I had left of any value. "You want a soul to balance the scales? You want someone to pay for the blood spilled on these floorboards? Take mine. Leave my innocent sister. Leave my unborn child. I will walk into the dark with you, Victoria. I offer you my life in exchange for theirs." The absolute silence that followed was deafening. Ruth froze. The demonic, mechanical rigidity of her posture slowly melted away. The entity inside her stared at me, processing the depth of my sacrifice. We had not come to plunder her home. We had unearthed her family with our bare hands. We had given them the sacred rights they were denied. And now, a father was willingly offering his own soul to right a historical wrong he had no part in creating. A single human tear rolled out of Ruth's pitch-black eyes, washing away the toxic black fluid on her cheek. "You gave us the earth," Victoria's voice whispered softly, entirely stripped of its demonic distortion. It was just the voice of a sad, broken young woman. "You gave us back our names." Suddenly, the rusted, blood-soaked velvet choker around Ruth's neck unclasped itself with a loud metallic click. It fell into the dirt, instantly crumbling into a pile of dry, gray ash. Ruth's eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed forward into my arms, completely unconscious, but breathing normally. The oppressive, freezing temperature in the house instantly vanished, replaced by the natural, biting cold of the winter morning. The suffocating stench of rot dissipated. The Sterling Manor was finally empty. We did not stay another hour. I carried Ruth out of that rotting tomb, guiding my weeping, exhausted wife and my youngest sister down the stone steps and through the heavy iron gates. We walked away from the bluffs, leaving the bones of the Sterling family resting peacefully under the earth where they belonged. Victoria Sterling achieved her salvation that morning, but her tragedy will haunt me for the rest of my days. The violence of men is a poison that seeps into the very soil of the earth. When we allow hatred, mob rule, and mindless prejudice to dictate our actions, we do not just destroy the living, we curse the ground we walk on. True evil is rarely born in hell. It is usually forged right here on earth, in the horrific, unforgiving cruelty we inflict upon each other. And if you ever find yourself seeking shelter in the dark, remember that some doors were closed for a reason. Leave the dead to their rest, or you might find yourself paying the toll for sins you never committed.